Hello, everybody. We're back. Another episode of Goddess Bible Study. Ed Dodge, I'm your host. LostGoddess.io is let me stop sharing for a moment so we can see everybody. LostGoddess.io is the website, is my Substack where you can see all the write-ups. We've got Lisa Adams in the house, our pagan priestess. We got Bishop Nathan Wilson coming in from Australia, our Gnostic bishop. And we got Father Joshua the Apostate, our Orthodox representative over here. So anybody want to say hello or anything you want to say before we get started?
We missed you, Ed.
All right, well, it's good to be back. It's good to be back. We took a couple weeks off, summertime stuff and travel and ayahuasca journeys and all that jazz. So let me share the screen here. And we're back into real history. So yeah, like and subscribe, everybody. And, we're working on the production value here and trying to raise the game here. So anyway, this week's Goddess Bible Study is the reforms of King Josiah, which is the last of the big reform movements of the First Temple against the goddesses. We've got an image here. We got our AI here. We got young King Josiah. These are all historical people. Hilkiah, the high priest, and they're doing the reforms. They're tearing down the Asherah pole. They're smashing some altars. They got, some fiery sky around the temple there. Don't look too close at the scroll there. Might make you think you're in the Matrix. But anyway, so in this episode of Goddess Bible Study, we continue with the three most important kings in the late First Temple period and the final, most sweeping revolt against the goddesses. Last episode, we covered King Hezekiah, a nearly messianic figure who saved the temple and the entire Yahweh movement from near extinction at the hands of the Assyrians. Hezekiah was one of the great Yahwist reformers, working to remove all the goddesses and all the pagan traditions and centralize worship in the Jerusalem temple around Yahweh alone. But Hezekiah's reforms did not outlast his reign, and they were reversed as soon as he died. Excuse me. So 698 to 642 BC is King Manasseh. So I actually had somebody write me a comment saying that they objected to my use of BCE before Common Era instead of just saying BC and AD because, we should keep the Christ in it, he said, basically. What do you guys think? Any thoughts on BC versus BCE? Anyone care?
Keep the BCE.
All right, that's one vote. So King Manasseh. Hezekiah died a few years after the Assyrian siege and was succeeded by his son. King Manasseh had Judah's longest reign, holding the throne for 55 years, but the Book of Kings only mentions him briefly. Manasseh reversed Hezekiah's reforms and reinstated pagan worship, placing a new Asherah pole in the temple. He is condemned in the Bible as one of the worst kings of Judah, but the historical record shows that his reign was a time of stability and trade. Yeah, they really don't like him, the biblical writers, as we'll see. The Yahwist reforms had never been popular with the people, who wanted their community altars back and desired the freedom to worship as they pleased. As soon as Hezekiah died, the Asherah poles and high places were restored. The Canaanites also continued their idolatrous superstitions and child sacrifice, and Manasseh is said to have sacrificed his own son in the fire. The people probably thought highly of Manasseh as he brought peace and prosperity to Judah. Manasseh was a loyal vassal of Assyria and is listed in the records of multiple kings as an ally. Judah had favored trade relations with Nineveh, and there were profitable exports of olive oil and wine to the empire. So the reinstatement of folk religion was likely a smart political move that earned the loyalty of the people, but the Bible does not see it that way. In rabbinic literature, Manasseh is said to have murdered the prophet Isaiah, and his idolatry is blamed for Jerusalem's later destruction by the Babylonians. The great rhetorical feat of the Bible and of later tradition is to reframe the invasions by outside military forces as being caused by Yahweh. It is hard to imagine anyone alive at the time taking seriously the claim that the mighty Assyrians or the Babylonians were following Yahweh and not their own, much more powerful gods, Ashur and Marduk. I want to talk about that for a moment before we get into this quote. The idea that this is the great thing the Bible does is everything, once they come to monotheism, then everything is controlled by Yahweh. And so they'll say that the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians is caused by Yahweh because they had failed to worship him properly. But if you were alive at that time and you're trying to make this argument to some Babylonians that that their god Marduk is really a really old and very highly esteemed god of the region of the era, that somehow Yahweh is more powerful than Marduk could be kind of ridiculous, or of Ashur. Um, so it's just like, but it worked. It worked in the context of monotheism. This is how people read the Bible, that Yahweh is the one causing the destruction of Jerusalem. But that's why I don't think that they're monotheists at this point. I think they're working towards monotheism, but they couldn't possibly be monotheists at this time because like all these much more powerful gods are running around. The Egyptian gods too. Um, so this is a quote. This is the whole mention of Manasseh in the Bible. I'm going to read the whole thing. So this is it's the book of Second Kings. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 55 years. His mother's name was Hephzibah, and he did evil in the sight of Yahweh by following the abominations of the nations that Yahweh had driven out before the Israelites. For he rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah destroyed, and he raised up altars for Baal. He made an Asherah pole, as King Ahab of Israel had done, and he worshipped and served all the hosts of heaven. That's like when the gods of the planets, it's the hosts of heaven. Manasseh also built altars in the house of Yahweh, of which Yahweh had said, "In Jerusalem I will put my name." In both courtyards of the house of Yahweh, he built altars to all the hosts of heaven. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced sorcery and divination, and consulted mediums and spiritists. He did great evil in the sight of Yahweh, provoking him to anger. Manasseh even took the carved Asherah pole he had made and set it up in the temple, of which Yahweh had said to David and his son Solomon, "In this temple and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will establish my name forever. I will never again cause the feet of the Israelites to wander from the land that I gave to their fathers, if only they are careful to do all I have commanded them, the whole law that my servant Moses commanded them." But the people did not listen, and Manasseh led them astray. So they did greater evil than all the nations that Yahweh had destroyed before the Israelites. And Yahweh spoke through his servants, the prophets, saying, "Since Manasseh king of Judah has committed all these abominations, acting more wickedly than the Amorites who preceded him, and with his idols has caused Judah to sin, this is what Yahweh the God of Israel says. Behold, I am bringing such calamity upon Jerusalem and Judah that the news will reverberate in the ears of all who hear it. I will stretch out over Jerusalem the measuring line used against Samaria, and the plumb line used against the house of Ahab, and I will wipe out Jerusalem as one wipes out a bowl, wiping it and turning it upside down. So I will forsake the remnant of my inheritance and deliver them into the hands of their enemies, and they will become plunder and spoil to all their enemies, because they have done evil in my sight and have provoked me to anger from the day their fathers came out of Egypt until this day. Moreover, Manasseh shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end, in addition to the sin that he had caused Judah to commit, doing evil in the sight of Yahweh.
Hey, Ed,
Yeah.
I just have to say, and I've said this in many different ways, and I'm going to say it again, that it just makes Yahweh sound like an abuser.
Oh, yeah, right.
Like he wants everybody to do what he says, and if they don't, he's instead of being like loving or like, oh, here, come worship me, I'm gonna strike you down. And I mean,
Absolutely.
where is the incentive there? What do they there I don't see where the people receive anything from Yahweh other than like abuse and anger and like just like having, I mean, if Yahweh was powerful enough to bring like calamity on the people, I just do not see what's in it for the people to follow Yahweh clearly, because they keep going back to the old ways that feel good and loving and nurturing and all of that. It just blows my mind.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've really come to characterize monotheism now as the religion of the divorced father who's a wife beater and child abuser. And this is why we got to bring back the mother goddess so we can get back, get away from the wife beating and child abusing. Divorced dad.
Well, that's a way of putting it too.
But I mean, it's just a different way to say the same thing.
I'd like to draw some attention to Manasseh building altars to the hosts of the heavens, the stars, the astral bodies. That gets often glossed over and doesn't get discussed often enough. The very fact that he was able to do that suggests that, I mean, there had to be, it wasn't just a fringe group that were paying attention to the stars if you were able to just put things into the courtyard of the temple. So,
yeah, I mean, it's very Mesopotamian. I mean, it's
very, very much so. Yeah.
So yeah, they're worshiping all the same Canaanite gods, which are the Canaanite gods are like this blend of Mesopotamian and Egyptian, but with heavy Mesopotamian.
But the hosts that would be the planets, though. That would be the wandering stars, the planets themselves.
I mean, my understanding when they talk about the hosts of heaven, that's the the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets.
Right.
And so El would be Jupiter, and Baal, or Saturn. I mean, Baal is Jupiter, and that's my understanding. Venus.
Some that also believe that El was beyond the cosmic waters as well, regarding the Canaanites as well, which is trippy. There were also groups that believed El had a dad. So, yeah, some scholars reckon around this time of the Babylonian destruction that this is where the Jewish people start to pick up apocalyptic beliefs. I wonder about that too.
I mean, they do kind of get destroyed here. So, all right.
Interesting.
So the Book of Chronicles adds another chapter to Manasseh's story, in which he is roughly captured by the Assyrians and taken prisoner to Babylon. In his distress, Manasseh prays to Yahweh, finds deliverance, and is restored to his throne in Jerusalem. Having found Yahweh, he proceeds with his own reforms, removing altars and foreign gods. That's the Book of 2 Chronicles 33. But neither the Book of Kings nor any Assyrian records mention these incidents, and the Book of Chronicles is clearly revisionist history throughout. It is always interesting to note which historical details get revised in Chronicles, like the smoothing over of rough edges in both David and Solomon's biographies, because it demonstrates the points of sensitivity and embarrassment in the narrative. The success of Manasseh's reign was clearly a sore spot for the biblical writers. A good pagan king was a contradiction they couldn't leave standing, so Chronicles quietly rewrote him into a penitent one. So 640 to 609 BCE, King Josiah the Reformer. So this is the heart of the story now. King Josiah is the important one. King Josiah was a grandson of Manasseh and took the throne at the tender age of 8. His father Amon had reigned only 2 years before being assassinated by his own officials. The people of the land then killed the assassins and placed young Josiah on the throne in his place. Josiah was the second great Yahwist reformer, and he is hailed in the Bible for his fealty to Yahweh. Some say he is the greatest king in the Bible because he hit the trifecta, following Yahweh with all his heart, soul, and strength. This was pointed out somewhere. Neither before nor after Josiah was there any king like him, who turned to Yahweh with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his strength, according to the law of Moses. Apparently, he's the only one that ever gets described that way with all 3. But it makes me wonder about Josiah being raised at age 8. He would have been, taken care of by, people in the courtiers and the priests and the courtiers. They would have been educating him, and at age 18 he becomes this Yahwist reformer. It makes me wonder, if the same officials that killed his father, or the same, maybe not the exact same guys because those guys got killed, but if they were trying to manipulate events and trying to steer the young king back to Yahweh, I can see that happening. So anyway, the reforms of Hezekiah and Josiah are the high water marks for the Yahwists during the First Temple period. King Josiah had a large influence on the writing of the Bible, as significant portions were likely written during his rule. When Josiah was 18, he ordered renovations to the temple in Jerusalem. During the work, Hilkiah, the high priest, discovered, quote-unquote, the lost book of Moses, the book of the law, which we now see in the biblical book of Deuteronomy. Modern scholars agree that a 600-year-old scroll couldn't have suddenly been discovered intact, and most believe it was actually written during Josiah's reign. The lost book of Moses was brought to the king and read aloud to him. Josiah was deeply moved by the words and immediately commenced reforms to bring his nation back into the grace of Yahweh. Josiah banned all other forms of worship and began a campaign to once again wipe out the pagan traditions and centralize worship at the temple in Jerusalem. So this is from 2 Kings 22. Then Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of Yahweh. And he gave it to Shaphan, who read it. Shaphan the scribe told the king, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. As Shaphan read it in the presence of the king, when the king heard the word of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law of Yahweh, written by the hand of Moses. And that's from Chronicles. Again, always elaborating a little bit more in Chronicles. This time it says, written by the hand of Moses. The first one doesn't say that. Of course, we don't think Moses wrote anything because there's no evidence they were literate at that time period. After finding the scroll, the priests then did something interesting. They consulted a prophetess named Huldah to confirm that the text was legitimate. She confirmed that the wrath of Yahweh was upon them. Huldah is one of only 7 prophetesses in the entire Jewish tradition, only 5 of whom that are named in the Bible, plus 2 more. Not much is known about her, but the Huldah gate on the Temple Mount still bears her name today. So we have talked about Deborah and Miriam were the first 2, and then Huldah's the third, and there's 2 more later on in the Persian period, and then 2 more in the post-biblical rabbinical text.
So I'm curious if we know more about what makes one a prophetess in that era, given that most likely most prophetesses were more like priestesses and more like, pagan and goddess oriented versus the ones that apparently are like, Yahweh's prophetess.
Well, she's married to somebody who works in the temple. So she's the wife of Shallum, son of Tikva, the son of Harhas, the keeper of the wardrobe, the priestly wardrobe. So these are folks associated with the temple. Again, there's just no details about her. This is the only mention of Huldah anywhere in history, and there's no mention of any other prophetesses at all. So we have no context to understand what they were doing in this time period at all.
Maybe, you gotta wonder if maybe they like, say, a prophetess or turn to a prophetess because she holds the divine feminine. She is sort of, speaks in more like the term of like a goddess and priestess. And that's why people might put more like faith in her or something of that nature.
I think there's something to that for sure. These, as we pointed out through God's Bible study, these women, these prophetesses, they show up at these critical moment junctures in the story to sort of like give, like when Judah and Tamar gets pregnant, they call her Kadesha. She's not a trivial woman because she is the great grandmother of the entire house of David, So they're getting this blessing of a Kadesha priestess early on, and in what becomes this holy line, and then they try to gloss over it and whitewash over it, but the clue is still there. And I think that's something like that is happening here, where like they need to get back and touch base with the divine feminine every once in a while at these critical moments to like bless things moving forward. I definitely think there's something to that.
Thank you.
So this generation of literate priests, and this is really an important thing, I think, in a discerning reading of the Bible, when you put it historically, is that what we know now from the scholarship is that, they weren't literate. As I was mentioning earlier, the idea that Moses is said to have written all this stuff, written the Torah, but there's no evidence that they were literate at all at that time period. And the Bible doesn't actually say that he wrote stuff down, really. It doesn't talk about them carrying scrolls or reading scrolls or doing anything like that. There's no indication internal to the story. Same with King Solomon, that they're ever literate. It never says King Solomon wrote anything. He gets credit with writing anything, but the story never indicates that him or anybody around him are writing anything. But then in the 9th century, when we see the Hebrew language show up in the archaeology, is when the writing starts showing up in the stories, in the tracks. And so now we're seeing the earlier generations never talks about them having scrolls, but now we're in the 7th century BC, and it does talk about them being literate. It talks about them writing scrolls, reading scrolls, and that's tracking with the archaeology, which I think is cool, because this generation of literate priests, which includes the prophet Jeremiah that we'll talk about next week, is known colloquially as the Deuteronomists by contemporary scholars. They're credited with writing the laws of Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, and that they preserved the older texts from both Judah and Israel, later carrying them to Babylon during the exile. And they are thought by most scholars to have written the historical books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, which share a common voice throughout. And I personally believe that this same generation also produced the Garden of Eden story, which is the divorce papers for the goddess, as part of these reforms that they're going through in this whole century, really, between Hezekiah and, not to put it like in a decade, but this whole general period. Josiah has a pretty long reign, 30 or 40 years. So you've got quite a while where they're able to work on this stuff. And there's clearly a common narrative thread between those 4 books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. When you read that, it's clear that there's a common author, just like the whole style and the whole perspective is that it reads like one common author. So whether they did it before or after the exile in Jerusalem or in Babylon, either way, it's this generation of priests are the ones that are handling the text, and they're the ones who take the stuff to Babylon in the exile. This group of guys that actually preserves what they choose to preserve and carry it with them. So this becomes a very critical, because it's only like 20 years later, the whole temple gets destroyed by the Babylonians. That's going to be the next episode. Jeremiah witnesses the destruction and they go into Babylon in the next episode. So this group of guys are pretty critical in terms of framing the whole history and preserving the history and giving their gloss to the whole thing.
Something I want to mention as well quickly regarding like papyrus papers back then. For a papyrus scroll, that would have been basically 1 or 2 days' wages of someone's work back then. For something as big as, say, a Torah or a Bible or something of account of religious writing, that would have been months or weeks of wages, possibly years, to afford such a scribe to do such a work as well, which people don't take into account as well.
Yeah,
so very expensive. It was like a blockbuster thing.
I don't think there's very many people doing literacy. And then they had to copy these scrolls just to preserve them. So it's like an act of constantly copying scrolls over and over again. In which case you get all sorts of like, did the text drift through error and editing and but it's very much, these are living documents, the individual scroll I don't think lasts all that long, really. Not like, hundreds of years. So anyway, so now we're going to get back to the Bible. We're going to read about Josiah here. So then the king summoned all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem, and he went up to the house of Yahweh with all the people of Judah and Jerusalem, as well as the priests and the prophets, all the people, small and great. And in their hearing he read all the words of the book of the covenant that had been found in the house of Yahweh. So the king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before Yahweh to follow Yahweh and to keep his commandments, decrees, and statutes with all his heart and all his soul, and to carry out the words of the covenant that were written in this book. And all the people entered into the covenant. Then the king commanded Hilkiah the high priest, the priest second in rank, and the doorkeepers to remove from the temple of Yahweh all the articles made for Baal, Asherah, and all the hosts of heaven. And he burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and carried their ashes to Bethel. Josiah also did away with all the idolatrous priests ordained by the kings of Judah to burn incense on the high places of the cities of Judah, and in the places all around Jerusalem, those who had burned incense to Baal, to the sun and the moon, to the constellations, and to all the hosts of heaven. He brought the Asherah pole from the house of Yahweh to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem, and there he burned it, ground it to powder, and threw its dust on the graves of the common people. He also tore down the quarters of the Kadesh, the male shrine prostitutes that were in the house of Yahweh, where the women had woven tapestries for Asherah. We'll come back to all these details and talk about them. Then Josiah brought all the priests from the cities of Judah and desecrated the high places from Geba to Beersheba, where the priests had burned incense. He tore down the high places of the gates at the entrance of the gates of Joshua, the governor of the city, which was to the left of the city gate. Although the priests of the high places did not come up to the altar of Yahweh in Jerusalem, they ate unleavened bread with their fellow priests. He also desecrated the Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnomah, so that no one could sacrifice his son or daughter in the fire to Moloch. And he removed from the entrance to the house of Yahweh the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun. They were in the court near the chamber of an official named Nathan Melech, and Josiah burned up the chariots of the sun. He pulled down the altars that the king of Judah had set up on the roof near the upper chamber of Ahaz, and the altars that Manasseh had set up in the 2 courtyards of the house of Yahweh. The king pulverized them there and threw their dust into the Kidron Valley. The king also desecrated the high places east of Jerusalem, to the south of Mount Corruption, which King Solomon of Israel had built for Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Sidonians, for Chemosh, the abomination of the Moabites, and for Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. He smashed the sacred pillars to pieces, cut down the Asherah poles, and covered the site with human bones. Hey, quiet, dog. Shh. He even pulled down the altar at Bethel, the high place set up by Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had caused Israel to sin. Then he burned the high place, ground it to powder, and burned the Asherah pole. So that's 2 Kings 23, 1-15. And then it's a little bit more. Just as Josiah had done at Bethel, so also in the cities of Samaria, he removed all the shrines of the high places set up by the kings of Israel who had provoked Yahweh to anger. On the altars, he slaughtered all the priests of the high places, and he burned human bones on them. Then he returned to Jerusalem. The king commanded all the people, "Keep the Passover of Yahweh your God, as it is written in the book of the covenant." No such Passover had been observed from the last days of the judges who had governed Israel through all the days of the kings of Israel and Judah. But in the 18th year of Josiah's reign, this Passover was observed to Yahweh in Jerusalem. Furthermore, Josiah removed the mediums and the spiritists, the household gods and idols, and all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem. He did this to carry out the words of the law written in the book that Hilkiah the priest had found in the house of Yahweh. Neither before nor after Josiah was there any king like him, who turned to Yahweh with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his strength, according to all the law of Moses. Nevertheless, Yahweh did not turn away from this fury of his burning anger, which was kindled against Judah because of all that Manasseh had done to provoke him to anger. For Yahweh had said, "I will remove Judah from my sight, just as I removed Israel. I will reject this city Jerusalem, which I chose, and the temple of which I said, my name shall be there." As for the rest of the acts of Josiah and all his accomplishments, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? During Josiah's reign, now this part's funny. During Josiah's reign, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, marched up to help the king of Assyria at the Euphrates River. King Josiah went out to confront him, but Necho faced him and killed him at Megiddo. 2 Kings 23, 19-29. So after all that stuff and all those reforms, he just gets whacked very unceremoniously by the king of Egypt, and Yahweh doesn't defend him at all. All right, so we can comment on all this stuff. Anything before I dive into the commentary?
The Euphrates River. That's interesting. There's seen a few battles. Also piracy, especially with Canaanite raiders as well, which has gone back to a long time. They would use those rivers to go out, and I believe it's to the Persian Gulf, and along those lines they could raid places like Ethiopia and all that sort of stuff, and that's why the Sarshu were also called troublemakers by the Egyptians by raiding their provinces. So I find that kind of interesting. So it's like a lot of violence around that region.
Yeah, especially in this time period. So Josiah's reforms were far-reaching. The Asherah pole installed at Solomon's temple was cut down, burned, ground into powder, and the dust scattered over the graves of her own worshippers. The burning of incense in the high places is condemned, as is the worship of Baal and other gods. So I think this part is definitely ritualistic. When they take the Asherah pole, cut it down, burn it, ground it to powder, and scatter it on the dust of people, that is, to me, is very clearly theological, spiritual warfare, and definitely a ritual for sure. Josiah removed the male Kadesh, but pointedly does not mention the female Kadesha, who are presumably left alone. The priestesses were always a much tougher target. So these are the male Kadesh, these are the trans folks, these are the transsexuals of their era. And they're getting chased out, only ever mentioned when they're being chased away, but this is one of those times. And the text also mentions that the women in the temple did sacred weaving for Asherah, using cannabis hemp, perhaps. Doesn't specifically say it, but it could be. But fabrics and tapestries were commonly used in temples of the period to create separate rooms, tents, and pavilions to house guests, vendors, or perhaps the Kadesha themselves. And weaving is obviously women's work, women's industry, women's income, and the goddesses are very much associated with weaving. Asherah is, so is Athena. It's one of the, great, the arts of civilization is weaving and associated with women for sure. So Josiah also desecrated the Topheth, the burial ground for infant sacrificed, so that it could not be used today. Perhaps, which is why no Topheth has ever been found. None have been found in Israel, so it's controversial whether they actually did it. All the ones that have been found were like in Carthage and some other places, but no one has dug up a Topheth in Israel. Josiah destroyed the high places that Solomon built for Astarte and the other foreign gods. Here the writers again refer to Astarte as Ashtoreth, the shameful Astarte, the vile goddess of Sidon, and confirming once again that King Solomon had worshipped her. So the slut shaming, here once again, the slut shaming of Astarte, the love goddess. They call her the vile goddess of Sidon, and of course Jezebel is from Sidon. Josiah even pulled down the altar at Bethel, a center for the worship of El, and the great rival to the Jerusalem temple. The altar of Bethel was first established by Jacob when he got the name Israel, and he wrote on it, El Eloi Israel. El is the God of Israel, not Yahweh. It was also the site where Jeroboam had built one of the golden bulls to El after Israel split from Judah. Josiah defiled the ancient altars by digging up the nearby graves and burning the human bones on them. The king condemned the shamans and spiritists and eliminated household god worship. Archaeologists have found shrines from this period that were deliberately overturned and dismantled, evidence that appears to confirm the reforms of Josiah and Hezekiah, which we discussed in the last episode, such as Tel Arad as an important site. The household gods mentioned may be connected to the smaller pillar-based figurines that archaeologists have found all over Israel. These figurines were popular in the 8th to 7th centuries BC, precisely during the reigns of Hezekiah and Josiah, and continued to be made right up until Jerusalem was overthrown and the Hebrews exiled. Though obviously feminine, scholars are not entirely sure what these objects were for, but they were common in households through Jerusalem. So these are the famous Judean pillar-based figurines. These are from some museum. I don't have the quite accreditation for it. But like 1,000 of these things have been found, and they're in a number of museums.
I think they're supposed to not just represent like women or goddesses, but like clearly motherhood and nurturing and nourishing. Yeah, like the gift of life.
Yeah. They're in the houses, they could be like little idols that they had on their home altars, and
100%. And even dolls maybe that children played with.
Or dolls that play with. All these things have been suggested for sure. And
yeah.
The point is nobody knows precisely. We just know they're common. They were using them for something.
All right. And clearly people could just hand make them themselves at home.
Yep. There's two different styles. These ones on the left are just, they call them pinch face.
Yeah.
They're clearly like being done with your fingers. And the ones on the right are done in a mold. And both sides, awesome. Both are equally common. So, 609 BC, the death of Josiah and the end of the house of David. So Josiah witnessed the fall of the Assyrian Empire and the sack of Nineveh in 612 BC, which we also discussed in a previous episode. All of a sudden, the landscape of political alliances shifted, but this turn of events did not work out well for King Josiah. In 609 BC, Pharaoh Necho II of Egypt marched his army up the Mediterranean coast to assist the Assyrians. So the Assyrians have lost Nineveh, but they have now another town called Carchemish on the Euphrates, which is like where they were their last holdout before they're finally destroyed. And at this point, Egypt and Assyria are in alliance against the Babylonians. So Pharaoh's marching up. The Egyptians attempted to cross through the Jezreel Valley and appealed to Josiah for permission to pass. Necho was not looking to fight Josiah, but the king rejected the Egyptian appeal anyway, as he was allied with the Babylonians for reasons that remain unclear. Josiah was killed at Megiddo, the only king of Judah ever killed in battle. This episode is considered a genuine historical event, even though no extra biblical evidence naming Josiah has ever been found. The Bible actually preserves two versions of his death, and the differences are telling. The account in 2 Kings that we already read treats it almost as an aside, a brief mention that Necho killed Josiah at Megiddo. The account in Chronicles, however, turns it into a full dramatic scene, filling in emotional and theological detail that the kings leaves bare. So this is from Chronicles. After all this, when Josiah had sent the temple in order, Necho, king of Egypt, marched up to fight at Carchemish by the Euphrates, and Josiah went out to confront him. But Necho sent messengers to him, saying, "What is the issue between you and me, O king of Judah? I have not come against you today, but I am fighting another dynasty, and God has told me to hurry. So stop opposing God, who is with me, or he will destroy you." Josiah, however, did not turn away from him. Instead, he ordered to engage him in battle. He disguised himself. He did not listen to Necho's words from the mouth of God, but went to fight him on the plain of Megiddo. There the archers shot King Josiah, who said to his servants, "Take me away, for I am badly wounded." So his servants took him out of his chariot, put him in his second chariot, and brought him to Jerusalem, where he died. And Josiah was buried in the tomb of his fathers, and all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for him. So apparently, King Josiah's dedication to Yahweh provided him no protection in battle and no assurance of victory. God, in this telling, was on the side of Egypt. Josiah's death brought an end to fealty to Yahweh in Judah. Egypt installed new vassal kings, all of them pagan, and a few years later, Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. Josiah's death at Megiddo marked the end of Judean independence and, for all practical purposes, the end of the house of David. The Yahweh's reforms, even at their most sweeping and sincere, were not enough to spare Yahweh's people from destruction and exile. Next episode, we will discuss the prophet Jeremiah and the destruction of Jerusalem, the exile to Babylon. All right.
Hey, Ed, why do you think they were so honest about that?
The first pass that they recorded was honest, and then with successive editing, they bury it in theological, they skew it theologically. So, but it's just a fact that King Solomon worshiped goddesses, and then they got to make excuses for it. It's just a fact that their best guy, Josiah, got whacked on the battlefield in a fight that he didn't need to go into. And it really makes him look dumb,
Well, and with regard to the invocation of God, even where the Pharaoh Necho says, "Look, you're getting in the way. God told me to do this," and then Josiah still dies. I mean, this just
that's
bad.
Chronicles. So that's clearly the second edition, and they're like, well, if not the third edition of this story, and now they're just saying, well, God's just on the side of Egypt just because they want to put God on the winning side of the battle. But this is what I was speaking to before about how they reframe the entire narrative so that all these foreign armies are agents of Yahweh and not Judeans,
Right. Well, I mean, the Egyptians would have been worshiping and speaking about different gods, I would think.
And Horus, right?
Yeah. But
and they've got their own very powerful gods.
But earlier in the narrative, there was the whole thing where Yahweh's like, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to wipe you off the map. And did so. Even
Josiah
when
did what he said.
Right, even Josiah undertook the reforms that Yahweh was looking for. So Yahweh didn't really care at all. It was more I kind of think of remember when you're kids and you have all the little green army men and you set it all up for this epic battle, and 2 seconds it takes to just go in and and destroy it. And I just think of Yahweh as being that sort of mindset. very like sort of mercurial, very sort of like, I don't know, maybe like bipolar and sociopathic. Just it makes no sense.
Well, in contrast to Jesus saves, Yahweh doesn't save anybody.
Mm-mm.
There's never anywhere where it's like Yahweh saves. Yahweh is salvation. Like, no, Yahweh is punishment. Yahweh is always punishment.
I think some of these
So
apocalyptic
then,
reforms took place to challenge these motives of the punishing God, rather putting it as, look, if they believe a perfect God wouldn't be capable of bloodshed and punishing his own people. So I actually see some of that apocalyptic and mysticism as a direct challenge to this war cult, basically.
Well, sure. By the time you get to the Gnostics, absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
And so at that point, then what I'm curious about is like, who is the God that they're speaking to and worshiping, and that ultimately is supposed to be the father of Yeshua or Jesus?
The Egyptians in that passage, or in general?
No, like what Nathan was just speaking to, like later on when somehow I guess God needs new PR or whatever, right? Like who is that God? Are they still talking about Yahweh?
I don't think so, because if you look at the words Jesus uses, he never says Yahweh. He just says Adonai, he says Abba, and he says Theos Subsistos, which is El Elyon. And he says that we're all children of El Elyon, but he doesn't say we're children of Yahweh. And if you look at the ones he's challenging, it's the Yahweh cult. And then the beliefs he states, Gehenna, a place of punishment. The Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians didn't believe this. This was apocalyptic and mystic beliefs only. They're the only groups that believed in, but they're torn between two groups, one that worships Yahweh, one that worships El, but the Yahweh they're worshipping isn't the same Yahweh. It's a blend of Yahweh and El. So it's like, it's weird. Judaism's weird.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Jesus does refer to, like, before Abraham was, I am. So he does play with the Yahweh.
Yeah, but the Yahweh doesn't really actually mean I am. If you go into Yahweh's meaning, it's a little bit different. It's along the lines of Baal, basically, for a Lord. But I am can be, it directly translates from different words. I'm unsure of the origins. It could be Yahweh, don't get me wrong, but it could also be Yahu or Yahweh. And it's a bit complex, so it goes back to that tribal element, and sometimes that directly, or Sabaoth, for instance, IAO, or AIAW, that's gone back to El, so an unpronounceable name of El. So it all comes from somewhere. It's just that the Yahweh cult adopted this. So it's hard to say who Jesus is really talking about, but he never says Yahweh by name, but he does say El Elyon by name.
That's also, there's another detail though, Nathan, which is in the Second Temple of Judaism, nobody said Yahweh. You weren't allowed to say the name Yahweh.
Exactly.
Yeah, on the feasts on certain times of the year, the Jewish people would gather up to hear them say the unpronounceable names of God. So you are right there as well. So, but then you could say there was cults that directly challenged that worship, and they worship El as the Father, like the Essenes. They viewed El as the God and Yahweh as his son, and they were the original group in the temple that were exiled out the temple. And we see them somewhat being against the Maccabees and Hamasseans, and then some of them were pro-Hamasseans. There's scholars that state that the book of Daniel is a direct speaking of Onias II, who was an exiled priest, and some even state that he was the teacher of righteousness. So it's kind of hard to say as well. There's definitely different groups that worship a different version of God or had a different understanding. I definitely see the El cult was exiled out of the temple and it was overthrown by the Yahweh worship. So if Jesus was wandering around the desert and hanging around an older group, if he was worshiping that God, it would explain why he's challenging the Yahweh priesthood. There's very big differences in their theology.
I think that is definitely a Gnostic, that could be a Gnostic point of view there. But when, like, he's referencing the Psalms in the text, it would be those Psalms he's referring to have Yahweh in them. So, but you could still all probably be right about that if there is some kind of, I don't know.
I definitely think there's a philosophical dispute
between who is actually being referred to, I suppose.
I mean, I see El and Yahweh as two separate gods. And I think that a lot of people in this time period, and that's kind of the fight they're having. Are these two separate gods, or are they, is it the same? And so obviously the monotheists want El and Yahweh to be merged, whereas other people see that as an impossibility because El is the kind, loving creator, and Yahweh is this nasty, genocidal, jealous abuser, and that there are two different characters and they shouldn't be merged together.
I agree, and I think that's why Jesus also stated those who came before me are pirates and thieves. Or if you want to put another translation, it could be predators and thieves. Why would he say that about previous prophets? There's contradictions in Jesus' teachings. A lot of it's been edited by the church for sure as well, but there's clear confliction there. Well, I don't get me wrong. I think there's possibility that Jesus did worship Yahweh too, probably, but as a lesser form of El, if not his son. And that could be baffling for some Christians to understand, but it's how it was in those times. It wasn't uncommon. There were Canaanites that followed Jesus later on and after his death that believed that he was Yahweh and that his dad was El. So,
I would love to.
Ed, you said something about that they were not even allowed to say the name of Yahweh during the Second Temple period. Is that right?
Yeah, they started using the word Adonai.
Adonai.
Okay. Do we know where that name originated?
So they call it the YHWH is the Tetragrammaton, and it's a very mysterious and subject to a great deal of theory and debate, and nobody really knows where the YHWH comes from, or how to say it, or whether they pronounce it Yahweh or they pronounce it some other way.
There's a Canaanite god called Adon as well.
Who's asking about Adonai?
Yeah,
Adonai. Isn't that a Greek?
There's a god called Adon, and it's the Adonai version, basically in that language. But it's not Adonai. It's the wrong word I meant to say. It's there's another god that's similar, with Adonis. So it's a Canaanite version of Adonis, basically, and it was Adon, and it could come from there. But El was also called Adonai.
And also,
if you look at the Hebrew word for God, it's El.
It's not being like a relevant language to anybody. Like after they get exiled to Babylon, like they stop speaking Hebrew, and so it just is strictly a language for the priests. Like it's a sacred language only by like this handful of like this little cartel of literate priests who are like writing their secret code to one another. Like it's not a common language in the second. They're not speaking Hebrew in the Second Temple. They're speaking Greek and other languages. Aramaic, I guess.
Yep. Yeah, as well as Aramaic.
You can.
So if they were speaking of God named like an Adonai, is that right?
Yeah.
Then does Adonai mean like the beloved?
Had a page of what it meant. I wrote down some Hebrew a while ago, and I might have lost it.
Adonai is a Hebrew name for
Lord
God.
Almighty is one translation, I'm pretty sure. Lord as well is another one from the Greek word Kyrios. So, but Hebrew is a bit different to the Greek. So, but the Greek is trippy because it also has Aramaic words in there as well. So there was definitely Aramaic speaking going on and diversity.
Right.
But
so
yeah,
what did you find, Ed?
It just means Lord. It's just another way of saying Lord.
Okay.
It's a Hebrew
also
word.
Sir and Master. I forgot about that one as well.
Okay.
Lord, Majesty. Anyway, let's talk about the reforms a little bit more. Josiah's a very interesting character. He looms very large in the biblical imagination, but he doesn't leave any real mark in the archaeology. Like there's no coins of Josiah. I'm surprised if they haven't found any. He doesn't show up in the record of the Assyrians. Like even the Egyptians who had left a record of this battle, like don't even like mention Josiah's name. So he couldn't have been. He doesn't seem to have been a very important figure to his neighbors. And people didn't like him. They reversed they all go right back to the paganism. Both as soon as both the former kings are dead, like they immediately Asherah poles are right back up. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah, it has a
But at the same time, it seems as though so many of the steps that were taken, like you were saying, when they burned the poles and ground it literally into dust to sprinkle over people's graves, like that seems to me more of an act of like reverence and respect versus, just complete destruction.
Right. It's not vandalism, right? It's very like, no, they take it seriously. Like the Oshawa pole is
Yeah.
definitely respected, and they can't, they gotta use their powers to like undo, like they gotta fight magic with magic, so to speak, like
But it's also like a returning of the goddess back unto herself, because she is earth, she is material, she is, she is the soil and
Right.
everything.
But it's very disrespectful. I mean, like they're digging up the bones of the people, and like they are trying to wipe them out. It's I wonder how it really went down. Like
Right.
this would be such a fascinating thing to go back in time to see these. And how much of these stories that we're getting is like complete fiction. Like how close to like
Right.
actual events are these even? Because I do think
Well-
something happened, but I think it's also always exaggerated.
Well, I mean, clearly so much of it is more psychological than anything, right? Including the burning of the bones, because that's just, that's just like to like mess with people and upset them and kind of get them in like riled up. And, that's kind of how a lot of that stuff works. It's like psychological.
Also an insulting of their afterlife too, basically too.
Oh, yeah, you're right about that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Oof.
True. Good point. Yeah, like disrupting afterlife traditions. There's a lot of ancestor worship. Certainly the Romans. I don't know about the Canaanites, but I think it's probably true. That yeah, ancestor worship. And so like if you mess with the family graves, you're probably upsetting the whole, the whole balance, the whole afterlife.
Removing your guardians and all that sort of stuff, because that was a belief thing. Even with some Jews, they believed that your family could be guardian angels. Not all Jews, obviously. Some didn't believe in angels or an afterlife. So it's
But, and then the like attempt once again, right, to centralize like religion and the power by telling people that they could not worship at home, which like, how are you going to police that?
Right.
Right. Other than other than taking their idols, if you will, or their statues, but that they could still worship at home instead of like having to go to the temple, because clearly going to the temple is like control and centralization, as opposed to having, letting people continuing, which I'm sure they did, to worship at home in their own way.
And of course, the people writing the text are the people doing these reforms. So the textual narrative celebrates these reforms as the greatest thing ever, even though the people, you can imagine, the people must have hated it. It must have been very unpopular.
Well, and then there Josiah goes to speak to, this Egyptian king on his way to battle with no protection. So who, like if he had stayed within the pagan practices and pantheon, he probably would have had the protection, right, going into that kind of a situation, because clearly Yahweh
didn't protect him.
Like, right, Yahweh. Yahweh.
It's so funny. It's so funny. The first time when I went back and I was doing my original research for History of the Goddess and read this story for the first time, I could not believe what I was reading. Because I just read it like on my own. Nobody prompted me to like about this stuff about Josiah. And then I go like, then he just gets killed. Like I couldn't believe it. And then, and because it tracks with what we were saying about King Solomon, that he worships the goddesses and he dies fat, rich, and happy in his bed, totally protected. And then next week we'll talk about with Jeremiah when they're going into the exile, and he gets in the argument with the women, and they say, and he castigates them for worshiping the Queen of Heaven, and they say, no, if we continue to worship the Queen of Heaven, it's only when we stopped worshiping the Queen of Heaven that calamity befell us. This is what we'll talk about this next week. And I think about that all the time, like those two contrasts between King Solomon keeps worshiping the goddesses and he's totally rewarded. These other characters later on stop worshiping the goddesses and they get wrecked. And that totally goes for Josiah as well. So I'm like, here I am just doing what Martin Luther said, go home and read the Bible for yourself. And everything I'm reading is like pro Mother Goddess. Like it's all like Yahweh doesn't save anybody. Like,
well, there's also a sort of metaphor there too for like when you forget about the goddess or when you dismiss her, when you're not reverent towards her, there's like, there's going to be the calamity, whether it's, like a tidal wave or an earthquake or a great flood or whatever it is. Of course, the earth mother is going to have her own expressions of things.
It was pretty cool that you mentioned the Earth Mother as well, because something that the Jewish Christians and Gnostic Christians had in common, they kept the earth as being sacred. The Ebionites have their writings, though we don't have the original text. The church burnt it. We have quotations from them, but they mentioned about the earth being the mother. They also mention the Holy Spirit being the mother, and that's also a Gnostic element as well. So there's something there as well. Also the worshipping of homes, Second Temple Judaism, they were making efforts to remove home worship and telling them they have to come to this temple only. They would mock the Samaritans saying, screw your holy mountain, you have to come here and worship. And then you look at Jesus stating that there'll be a time when we can worship anywhere. There's still direct challenges there, but the mother's kept there in those two traditions, but you don't see it in Orthodoxy, you don't see it in Catholicism, except in the version of the Virgin Mother. But you see an older element reference of the earth in these older groups in the Jewish Christians and Gnostics.
Well, I wonder how much this idea of like home worship, also given that your home in that case becomes your temple, like, I mean, that's how I view my home. And if you were to come here, and you're all invited and welcome to come and visit, but if you were to come here, you would understand, as everybody does the moment they walk in here, that there's a vibe and that everything kind of looks like an altar. It is a sacred space to me. I have dedicated it as such. It has a feeling to it. It is my personal temple. And, and I invite people into this temple. So like, I wonder if we were to consider, we talk about real estate and investments and all of that, but what if we were to think more along those lines with regards to home as, a sacred space, a temple space, and how that might shift some of the ways that we as a society operate with regards to housing.
And even bigger than that, how about our entire civilization? Make our entire civilization be sacred. Including our life.
Yeah.
And homes don't get treated very well by a mass group of people. Like here in Australia, we have the indigenous population here, and they're known to light fires in their own houses, destroying their houses, ripping open the walls and starting fires, which isn't really good. But there's also other people that do that in poverty as well, destroying their homes as well. It should be something sacred you come home to, you, especially those that share it with others, their family, their loved ones.
Yeah, the place where your ancestors were born and where your offspring and your descendants could be born or come through. Like it kind of in a way becomes a portal as well.
Well, we used to bury our dead in our homes. And
our backyards, we used to lay them out in the living room and sit with them for days, right before we put them into the earth.
That interview I did with Bernie Taylor a couple of weeks ago, we talked all about Çatalhöyük, which is the earlier Neolithic settlements where they were totally burying people beneath, not everybody, but like certain special people would be buried beneath the floorboards of the home, in the basement of the home. And then, but he pointed out something to me, that they've done modern DNA analysis on them. And what they're finding is that it's basically all women, and that it's all these matrilineal lines. It's like the queen mother, or not, it's like the family, the matriarchs whose bones are being preserved. And then it's mother, daughter, all the way down the line to nieces and stuff. And that's because it's not everybody. Like there's too many people to like bury everybody in the house. It's only special people. But the modern DNA analysis is being done on it.
To make a nod to your Substack, Ed, where you're talking about Dr. Sinclair, like that what you just said just kind of is good evidence to contradict maybe that notion.
Did you guys read my article on academics and goddesses?
Yeah, it was very
I
good.
didn't get there, but I'm excited to.
Yeah, no, read that one. I'm really pleased with it. I think it turned out really well. So I exchanged some Facebook texts with this woman who I was criticizing. She was very butthurt that I criticized her. And she said she's not an atheist and kind of like was pretty indignant that I called her an atheist, even though I was really trying to make the point that academia is atheist. And I stand by that comment, that scientific materialism and anything that gets published in an academic journal is atheist by nature, regardless of whether the academics themselves are atheists. The work is an atheist piece of work because that's the only thing that's allowed to be published. You have to use a materialist framework inside of academia nowadays, and they very much ring fence, and gatekeep what is acceptable inside of academia. They do not engage with these ideas on a theological basis. And so to just engage with this stuff through academic journals, which is what she told me to do. She's like, if you read more academic journals, you'd know what you're talking about. And I was like, piss off, lady. Like, that's the whole point, is that like I disagree with the academics. I didn't really get into too much with her. She was like, I'm not gonna talk to you anymore. But she was very annoyed that I criticized her. Even though I really wasn't trying to be personal about it. Her work was really good. It's just that you got to read it because like she lists every single important piece of text from the 1850s on that has developed these mother goddess ideas, which were very popular in the 20th century, like very popular and really like gaining a lot of steam up until Maria Gamboudas. She was the last one. She died in 1994. She was the last goddess academic. And ever since the 90s, they've been poo-pooing on matriarchies, ritual sex, goddesses, the whole 9 yards, the triple goddess. They know all about it. And they're like, it's all bullshit. And I'm just like, you guys are crazy. And I frankly don't think the work is very good. The scholarship. Cynthia Eller is one who's written on matriarchies. I don't agree with her work. Stephanie Boudin is the only one who wrote on ritual sex, poo-pooing the idea of temple prostitution. She's the only one who wrote it. I think her work sucks, frankly, because he totally cherry picks the evidence. I can totally write a critique of her work because I don't think it's very good. And yet everybody references her. Everybody references Stephanie Boudin as though she somehow single-handedly deconstructed the entire notion of ritual sex. Nobody else has like backed up her work with more scholarship. All the other scholarship says otherwise. So I'm really super critical of the academics in this field. I find them quite maddening and frustrating to deal with. And she was a perfect representative. What's his name? Richard. He's a Jesus mythicist guy. He's kind of fuck, his name will come to me. I got in a big argument with him. He wouldn't talk to me on camera. These guys are lame. I just think they're so lame.
Well, they're keeping a very closed-minded view, certainly, and not considering different possibilities and perspectives, which is that is disappointing. That's such a shame because you would like to think that academia is about having those kinds of discussions and, like explorations and staying curious and learning more.
No, they absolutely are not. Ever since the post-Cold War, Western academia went completely off the rails. Once Michel Foucault became the most cited scholar in Western academia, he's a famous postmodernist who says there is no fundamental reality. There is no truth. There's only power structures and who gets to determine truth. Ever since Michel Foucault became the number one scholar, it's been downhill ever since. Judith Butler too, I think, is totally a wreck. So I don't trust the contemporary scholarship in the humanities at all. I think they're it's gotten really bad, really toxic. All the eco-Marxism that I was involved in is all super toxic. So, but I'm going to look forward to getting into it with them more. It was kind of a fun conversation.
Well, the point.
I think really what's happening though is that the change isn't going to come from, and is clearly not coming from, the academics, right? It's much more of a grassroots, like, and also sort of like a wave of consciousness that is shifting into, you know, different understanding and like accessing what's within our DNA because it's ancient, right? It goes so far back. So I feel like that's the direction that things are headed, and like most things, it has to come from the ground up, especially if we're talking about something that's more goddess oriented, because we've got to start with the earth. We've got to start with what's beneath us and what is true and real. And pretty much the only thing we can point to that is true and real is nature, because everything else is fake or contrived or manipulated or, you know, mind control stuff. It really is. But that's, I mean, that's some of my personal thoughts on how things work.
Well, I like the nature comment, and I like the fact that, I mean, like we were just speaking about the DNA that's found with following tracking a matriarchal line, that says a lot. I mean, that's the kind of evidence that we're kind of itching for, that says what we're getting at in this Bible study is that there is an element here that has been eradicated by these forces, and we see these forces alive and well in academia. We see it through the history of the church. When we were talking earlier, I was reminded of a man in the 2nd century, Marcion, who was condemned as a heretic because he saw what we're seeing in these scriptures. He was like, this Yahweh figure in the Old Testament, how are we supposed to reconcile this man as the father of Jesus? He really had a problem with this big time. And the church just flat out said, you're a heretic. We don't want to hear your opinion, and condemn that whole line of thought in an effort of control, just like the academians are trying to control the narrative now.
Totally.
So I think, Lisa, to your
He also
point,
made the first New Testament as well. And then it took 200 years for the Catholic Church to make their own to challenge him, which is a long time for a Bible to not be in existence. And they just called him basically a follower of Simon Magus, saying that Simon Magus was the father of all heresies. But Marcion was a Paul fanboy. He was like, well, go Paul. He could not help but speak about Paul. He viewed his theology coming from Paul. But if you look at Simon Magus, he also stated that Yahweh was the demiurge, and he was a Samaritan Jew, and he got baptized by Philip. He's the only guy that's writing that we know for a fact, without a question, that actually met the disciples, that we have his text. Though we don't have that original text like Paul, but we know for a fact a lot of Paul's letters are all church edits. But we have something older from Marcion that we know that met the disciples. We know he existed. We have more evidence that Simon Magus existed than Paul. So we had people that were even worshipping Simon Magus as a god, or associating a Mars statue with him, so associating that this fellow was deified. And he viewed that Yahweh and the angels were creators of this world, but basically in rebellion against God, or in some stories maybe under orders. It depends. It's up for the interpretation of what that belief of Simon Magus is. But his theology is interesting. He mentions the Garden of Eden, Exodus, Leviticus, and he's stating all this as symbolism for the child in the womb coming out of the mother and being exiled and having to find God again. A very different interpretation of mainstream Judaism. So we have this thought going on for a long time, which is pretty fascinating, of a challenging of Yahweh. Simon Magus believed that Jesus became the Logos and replaced Moses as the law of God, and his God was El. And we see this theology similar to the Margaria or Margarites in the BC era, way before Jesus existed. And they believed that Yahweh was the demiurge and creator of this world under the orders of the Most High God El. And that's a BC era Jews. They could be the ancestors of the Essenes. They were called cave dwellers. So they could have been the group of Jews that were exiled to their temples and lived in caves and holes.
Fascinating. Every time you open your mouth, Nathan, I'm like, whoa, how much you know. It's wow.
I would love to know what the original Jesus was actually teaching, because it's totally lost to us and we'll never know. It's just everybody's got an agenda. Everyone talking about Jesus has got an agenda. and it's really hard to untangle. What was the original guy? Was that really all about?
I'd love to know. Even if I was wrong, I'd absolutely love it.
If Yahweh was Jesus's dad, then maybe Jesus is like, the sort of rebellious son, like rebelling against everything his dad said and stood for or whatever. But
definitely don't think
whenever I have listened to the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, or because I have listened to it on YouTube, and then the Gospel of Thomas, and you get to hear what those two have to say. It's my understanding that Thomas literally wrote, like that's older, and he literally wrote Jesus's words, but without the context and story around, like, well, when he went to the temple on the mount or whatever, it's nothing like that. It's just literally the words of Jesus, of Yeshua. It's very different sounding when you can take it in that way. And then the way that the Magdalene speaks is also, it's very different, and it does sound much more loving, and it feels like the goddess is just all through the text.
Well, we will have a lot to say when we get to Jesus in Goddess Bible study. That will be spend many episodes. I learned something new about Philip the other day that I didn't know, that I didn't quite realize, was that he's credited with going to India. So, like, he went to India in like the year 50 or something and stayed there. And like, they have it, like, he was one of the first, because I was looking up how long has Christianity been in India? And they said the first, that Philip, one of the first, or Thomas, I mean, one of the original disciples, the author of the Gospel of Thomas, was in India for a long time and started a whole church there, and has been there since, since day one. It's in that also plays into these, and that's separate, but plays into the idea that Jesus may have been in India during, he was missing for 18 years. We don't know anything about Jesus between age 12 and age 30. So a lot of people think he went to India. There's also traditions that he was in India for a while, which would make sense. And it makes sense why the Gnostic Gospels are so, Gospel of Thomas specifically is so Eastern influence. I mean, you read the Hinduism, Buddhism is just like all over it. It's very Eastern mystical framing of much of what's going on in that. So it all makes sense, that there's this Eastern influence. But I didn't really realize that actually the archaeology is pretty sound, that he was really there like the year 53 or something and remained. Anyway, maybe we should wrap it up. Probably at the right amount of time here. Any final comments before we close out the night?
No, Ed. Great topic tonight. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Joshua. Thanks, Nathan. And thank you, everybody, for anyone who's still listening. LostGoddess.io for the write-ups, and please subscribe and all that. And next topic will be Jeremiah and the exile to Babylon. So good night, everybody.
Bye.